ears to hear these things. And we do all these things for your glory, Lord. I ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
And so I'm going to go into Luke 18, 9 through 14, and it's the parable about the Pharisee and the tax collector. The parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector and how they pray. And we've heard this one before, and we think a lot that this is just about prayer, which it is, but there's more to it than that. And I think there was more to it than that when Jesus was talking about it, and that's what I want to bring up. So let's just get started on it right away. Luke 18:9, this is where it begins. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Now this is the beginning of this parable, and in this section of Luke, there are parable after parable after parable after parable. He talks in a lot of parables there, and Luke had written them all out. And this one has an introduction to it because it says he's speaking to someone specifically, and he says, to those who are confident of their own righteousness. I saw this and I started thinking about it from our perspective. And if we think about it, Jesus is talking and telling these parables. Who's he telling them to? To his disciples, to his followers, to the people that are around there listening. So that means that some of his followers and some of the people that were listening to him fit into this category. Some of Jesus' followers fit this category. So we have a tendency when we read through the New Testament, we hear all the things of the Pharisees and the way Jesus dealt with the Pharisees in the Gospels. We have a tendency to think, boy, I'm glad I'm not a Pharisee.
Yeah.
I do too. I look at that and I think, boy, I'm glad I'm not a Pharisee. But then we're going to get into what the Pharisee says, and by golly, he says, I'm glad I'm not somebody too. So I think we need to be cautious that we are not falling into this category. And this warning is not for someone else. This warning is for us. That's what this means.
Right.
So he brings this up to someone who is confident in their own righteousness. And he talks about two going up and two going down. Well, I want to get into just a little bit more about this. What is righteousness? Now, this is the dictionary definition. This is, forgive me, children, copy and pasted, which I never allow the kids to do in school. This is copy and pasted right from the dictionary. Righteousness is a noun that means the quality of being morally right or justifiable. That is the word that we use in English. And unfortunately, we miss a lot of the meaning biblically when we try and put it into this, because we take this first part, the quality of being morally right, as what righteousness is. And biblically, being justified is what righteousness is. It's not being morally right. If it was being morally right, the Pharisees would have had it right, because they were morally right. Righteousness is more than that. And sometimes I think we lose that a little bit. There's two different words that are mentioned when we talk about righteousness. The first one is dikaios, which is Greek, and that's a common Greek term, and it was a word that they used to separate themselves from others by saying, we're civilized and the other ones are barbarians. We're civilized because we do things the right way. Now that is a word that in English would probably translate to righteousness. The Bible has a different word that is used, and that is tzedakah. And tzedakah means the righteousness of grace given by God. That's the justification again. That means justified by God. Not by ourselves, not by what we do, not by what we earn.
Amen. Straight
from God. That is all the righteousness we will ever receive in this world. The only righteousness we get is from God, God's justification. So when we talk about these things, and Jesus is talking about this to his followers, when he says the things he says in this parable, there's a lot of context there, and I'll of course go into that. But there's a lot of parallelism with the Old Testament. There's parallelism in Isaiah in this, and there's also parallelization in Micah. So let's go into Micah next. Micah 6, 3 through 5 says, my people, what have I done to you? Have I burdened you? Answer me. I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, and also Aaron and Miriam. My people, remember what Balak king of Moab plotted and what Balaam son of Beor answered. Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. And this is that tzedakah here. That you may know the justification by grace that has come from the Lord. Not that they earned it, not that you deserve it, but this is what God has done. This is the word that we're talking about today. This is the justification we're talking about. So let's go into our parable a little bit. It starts out, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. All right, 2 men went up. They're even at that point. But Jesus said one was a Pharisee and one's a tax collector. Well, the Pharisee is held up in society at that point in time as being the morally righteous ones. They're the leaders. They're the scholars. They're the knowledgeable ones. They're the ones that know all the rules and keep all the rules. And the other one's a tax collector. And we know from reading our Bibles and looking in the New Testament what a tax collector was worth in their society. The tax collector was considered the lowest of the low, not because of the job, but because they took the job. The Romans were occupying Israel. The taxes that were being collected were given to the Romans. The Jewish people at the time, of course, really disliked the Romans. But the only thing worse than a Roman was a tax collector, which means he was a turncoat. He was a Jewish guy that went to the Roman side to collect these taxes. But they were still Jewish. They were working for the Roman government, but they were still Jewish. And this man that Jesus is about to talk about was Jewish. So right off the bat, he's holding 2 people up that society would say, okay, here's this one, and here's this one. And Jesus says, these 2 men, the highest of the high in society's eyes and the lowest of the low, both go to worship. Both go to the temple to pray. Okay? And then he starts out with the Pharisee. He said the Pharisee stood apart. Verse 11 says, the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, and adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. Okay, we're going to see that the Pharisee stood apart, and then it talks about the tax collector stood afar. So they both separated themselves. So they came up equal, 2 men. Not so much equal in anybody's eyes, but 2 men. And they both went and they separated themselves off. Well, the Pharisee is going to separate himself off for a specific reason. If he so much as touches the clothes of an unclean person, he is unclean himself according to the law. He can't touch an unclean person. And I'm sure he's going up there in all his finery in addition, but he can't be with these other people. He has no idea who all these people are, but they might be these people like this, so I'm going to keep myself insulated and separate, and I'm going to put myself up in my own personal space. By doing that, by separating himself off, he's putting himself a little higher than everybody else, but he's also following the rules in his eyes. My question is, of course, do we do that? Well, we would say no. That would be our first thought, is no, we don't do that. But I want you to think about this concept. How many of us today think of our lives as being set on a scale? The old-fashioned scale where you've got the 2 sides to it. We consider it justice. That's our sign of justice in this country, isn't it? We have justice is a statue that's blind and holding scales. It weighs out good and bad. We think of it that way. Do we also think of our own salvation that way? When I get to heaven, they're going to weigh things out. And if I'm heavier on one side than the other, I'm good. We would like to say no. And as Christians, we should definitely be saying no, because it's not something we do. There's nothing that could go on that scale on our side. There's nothing that we can put on the positive side of that scale. That all comes from Christ. But I think sometimes in our hearts we forget that. Because once we start thinking, I'm a little more on the good side than the bad side, we start looking at other people and start putting them on a scale too. So the Pharisee's doing that. He's putting himself up. Now, when two men are going to the temple like this, Jesus isn't talking about a special holiday here. He's talking two men go up to the temple to pray. In the temple in Judaism, there were 2 times a day that it was open prayer time. One was at dawn and one was at 3 o'clock. And both of those times, what they did was they sacrificed a lamb for atonement. Excuse me, I think this is particularly important here that we understand this context. The lamb is sacrificed daily for atonement. And this is the time when people gather together. So the lamb is sacrificed in a ceremony, the blood is sprinkled on the altar. All these things happen. At this point in time, even if people weren't there, it was not uncommon for pious Jews that were following the law to stop at 3 o'clock and pray, even if they weren't in the temple. The lamb gets sacrificed, and the priest goes out, takes the incense to the outer court, trims the wicks on the lamps, does that. There's a ceremony involved in that. And then the priest goes inside the Holy of Holies and offers incense there. And it's going in to see if their sacrifice is acceptable. When he does that, they sound these silver trumpets and gongs and things. And that's the time when people take their personal time to prayer. So when he's inside, they go into prayer. And that's when this Pharisee would have said this. So there's a public worship going on here, and then there's a private time, and there's private worship going on. So the Pharisee is standing by himself, and he says these things. Now, when he's talking about these things, I think there's a few things that, again, in context, I want to bring up. The intended prayer is that we, just like the Lord's Prayer, we start off with confession of our sins, then we thank God for what we do receive from Him, and then we ask for more. We petition Him for things that we need or others need, just like we did just a moment ago. We come to Him with our prayer list. And this is the order of things. First of all, acknowledging who He is and who we are as a sinner. Secondly, we thank Him for what we've received. So here's what the Pharisee does instead. Instead of acknowledging God for who God is, he says, "Thank you for not making me like other people." He doesn't want to acknowledge God for who God is. He wants to be acknowledged for who He is. The Pharisees had a tendency to think of the law as like this big garden. And not only was it a garden, the law was a beautiful thing. But to protect it, we're going to put a fence around it. We're going to put a wall around it. We're going to add laws to it. They added all sorts of rules outside of there. Because, heaven forbid, some poor sap walks in and treads on the garden. So we better put a fence around it, make it harder for everybody. So they did that. Okay? Now when he prays for himself, he has all sorts of things that he says. But one of the things he talks about is fasting twice a week. Now, the only fasting that was required was the Day of Atonement. Once a year there was the Day of Atonement and everybody fasted. The Pharisees added 2 days before and 2 days after for themselves. To show their own righteousness, they had 2 days before and 2 days after, so they had 5 days of fasting. Oh, woe is me, I'm fasting 5 days. Well, this guy goes and says, I fast 2 days a week. Not 2 extra days, but 2 days a week I'm fasting. I'm way up here. In addition, he says tithing. Now, the tithing that he talks about, again, according to Jewish law and tradition at that time, you would tithe food, anything you would watch over, and things that come from the ground. Just like Abel and Cain. Okay? What was produced is something you would tithe on. And he says, I tithe on everything. There is nothing here in this that is truly a prayer. Now, I'm sure in his own mind he's giving some sort of ethical lesson to the people that are around him. By praying out loud and saying these things, he's kind of giving a sermon in a prayer. And forgive me if I've ever given you a sermon in a prayer, because that's not what prayer is meant for. But that's what he's doing at this point in time. It's all about him. He's talking about himself, and how good he is and how righteous he is and how I've reached the pinnacle already and these people haven't. Thank you, Lord, for putting me above everyone. And that's not a prayer to God. That's a prayer to himself. Now let's contrast that. Here comes the tax collector. Luke 18:13 says, "But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, 'God have mercy on me, a sinner.'" So the tax collector also is isolating himself from people, but he's not isolating himself because he's afraid of being unclean by touching someone else. He's isolating himself because he feels himself as being a lowly person. And he's isolating himself at a distance. Here's a guy in the back of the church, not the front of the church. He's standing at the back. Now, whether he's standing at the back because he doesn't want to get in people's way or have people be upset with him, doesn't matter. He's standing back there because he doesn't feel like he deserves any more than just stepping over the threshold. And also because he recognizes that's all that's necessary, is to step over the threshold. Not everyone had to come and pray. This was a daily thing, and some people did, some people didn't. He didn't have to go there. He could have prayed at home. He felt it necessary for him to go and step across that threshold and be there. Now it says he would not even look up to heaven. The typical prayer position that people would have been praying at that time is they crossed their arms across their chest, they bowed their head. This man, it says he would not even look up to heaven. He just kept himself down the whole time. And it said, but he beat his breast. Now that, when I read about this in context, it surprised me. He beat his breast, which means they would beat themselves over the top of the heart. Biblically, there was one other time when it's talked about. Now, in Middle Eastern culture, this is usually something that is at a particularly sad funeral, a great loss, something like that. You would see someone doing this. But biblically, they only talk about it once. Everybody know when that is? It was right after Jesus died. It was right after Jesus died when everything turned dark and they felt the earthquake. And people suddenly went, oh, something's wrong here. And they started beating their breasts then. In traditional Middle Eastern culture, women would do it and not men. But that time of Jesus, probably everybody was doing that. And when Jesus tells this parable, here's this man humbling himself that much more and acknowledging that much more how much he needs God. It's a short passage. It's not much. Jesus doesn't go into great depth here because people don't need to go into great depth if they understand all these things that are going on. We have a tendency to sometimes slide over things because we don't know the context, we don't know what's going on, we don't know some of the depth here. But if you were listening, and if you're listening today, Jesus is comparing A and B. And remember what it said in the beginning. Jesus was talking to people who he was putting in the category of the Pharisees. You think so much of yourself. I want to draw this picture for you. Who are you? Do you come with your head up, proud, or do you come with your head bowed, humble? Who are you in all this? So the tax collector comes in this and comes in a mercy type thing. And again, mercy, I want to look at this last passage here where he actually says, all he says is, God have mercy on me, a sinner. But again, we lose a little bit in English translation. Mercy is not the word that would be used when it was written in Greek. The word is atonement. God atoned for me, a sinner. We have the lamb being sacrificed, and this man understands the concept of that. This is a time of atonement where the sins of Israel are being wiped away by the blood of the lamb. And this man understands that and says, Lord, atone for me. I can't do it. I'm not worthy of it. I can't do any of this. Lord, I'm just praying that you atone for me, a sinner. He is acknowledging who he is. When I look at this and I see this concept, I think, you know what? In my heart, I know that the tax collector is doing it right. But in my head, sometimes I do it like the Pharisee. Sometimes I'm not doing it like the tax collector. Jane had an incident this last week that made me think about some of these things. Typical, she was at LTM and by herself, and she comes out and there's a man standing there asking for money. She gives him a dollar or something, and she talks to him for a while, and afterwards she said, I felt bad I didn't pray for him. I should have done. It slipped her mind. But she said, I just kept thinking, how did someone get to that point? How can someone get to that point in their life? What would his story have been? Where did he get from, the little kid in kindergarten, and the kid growing up in school that we see in the lunchroom, the kid that's out here playing on the street doing all these things? Turn something off, Pete? No. When all these things, we see all these things with the people that we see on the street, how did they get from A to B? There's a saying that we say sometimes as Christians, well, there, but for the grace of God go I. Are we saying that because we're thankful for the grace of God, or are we saying that because we're thankful we're not that person? Whatever happened to him didn't happen to me, thank God. There's a difference there. We have to keep that in mind, that's concept needs to go beyond just, I thank God I'm not like someone else. Jesus' primary concern here is not just for prayer, but it's also for not for breaking the law. Because if you follow the law, the Pharisees got it right, and the tax collectors got it wrong. Jesus is saying, I'm not talking about the law here, I'm talking about the relationship. It's not about the law, it's about the relationship. This man came to God with the right heart. I don't care what else he did. He came to God with the right heart. This man came to God with the wrong heart. I don't care what he did, but he came in wrong. Now there's a passage in James. I don't know if it's going to come up here or not.
The thing though.
Okay. In James 2:10, the Bible says, if you keep all the laws but one, it's for nothing. If you keep all the laws but one, it's for nothing. And we know that it's impossible to keep all the laws of God. On a daily basis, every one of us is going to fall short. On a daily basis, if you examine your life, on a daily basis, there is no way you can say, I didn't do anything against God today. None of us. None of us can say that.
That's right, I have.
Okay, just go from the beginning and then click through them till you get that. Or, no, just click through them quick, Steve. The analogy that I read about this, I really liked with this James one. If you're playing baseball and you hit a home run, and you touch all the bases except one, it's for nothing. It doesn't count. And that's what's being said here in James, is it just doesn't count. All the ones except one. Back up, there you go. Whoever keeps the whole law and gets stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. I think that's every one of us every single day. Paul talks about this. Now, Paul was a Pharisee. He had it right in the eyes of everyone. He had it right top to bottom. He was a young, very well-educated man, was on fire for the law, was on fire in the Pharisees, was well thought of in the Pharisees, held the cloaks when they were stoning people. He was the man. He had everything right, was actually sent by the head of the temple to go pursue these people. He had everything right. And then he met Jesus. And he had a realization at that point in time. In Philippians 3, he talks about this. Verse 8 through 9. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus of my Lord. for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage, that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness that comes from God on the basis of faith. Here's where the rubber meets the road. Here's what Paul's talking about. It's the same thing Jesus was talking about, folks. It doesn't really, there's no difference. The righteousness that comes from God. The grace that we receive from God is the only righteousness we will ever have. When we stand in front of him, when that day comes and you're standing there and you're looking him in the eye, it's not about anything you did. You didn't earn it. You didn't deserve it. Ever. There's not a day in our lives where we have earned the grace of God. The only thing we can stand on facing God face to face is the blood of his Son. That is it. That is the only righteousness we have. Keeping that in mind, then how do we pray? Well, the first thing is we ought to be praying in confession and saying, yes, I am a sinner today, Lord. I was a sinner yesterday. I'm a sinner today. That hasn't changed. But I am so grateful for your Son and your salvation. Acknowledging how low we are and how high he is. Acknowledging that relationship and that need for that relationship. Confession's hard. Confession's difficult. It's hard to admit when we do something wrong. It's really hard. When I said this before, it's a natural human thing we see in little kids. You catch them doing something wrong, and the first thing they say is, but he did this, but he hit me first, but he did that. I had one of my 7th graders pull that on me this week. He was turned around when I was teaching, and I said, you need to stop what you're doing, turn around and be paying attention. Am I boring you or something? And he said, well, he threw a piece of paper at me. I said, what does that got to do with the fact that you're turning around and not doing what you're supposed to do? Well, would you not turn around if somebody threw a piece of paper at you? I said, what's that got to do with what you're doing? I'm not telling him what he's doing is wrong, but I will. I'm asking you about you. Personal responsibility. I think as a country, as a society, we are way out of bounds on our personal responsibility. We don't take responsibility for nothing.
Right.
There is nothing in this world that we're supposed to be responsible for. It's always someone else. How do I know that? Because instead of being sinners, we're victims. Look at the news. Look at what people say to each other. We're not sinners on our own right because of what we do. According to the world, we're just a victim.
Yeah.
You're going to lay on a couch and tell me it was your mother's fault. Really? We laugh at that. We do. But in reality, don't we want to be an adult and make our own decisions? Of course we do. We don't want somebody else telling us what to do? Of course not. Then we also take responsibility for those actions that we do. And those actions are the actions of sinners. That's who we are. We cannot accept salvation without accepting ourselves as sinners.
Amen.
We forget that sometimes. I think on a daily basis we need to be in our face before God saying, I'm still here. And I will never be able to make myself anything else unless you lift me up.
Right.
That's it. And I think that's what Jesus was talking about here. Our first step towards forgiveness needs to be a grief about our own sins. When Jesus talked about this, he talked about who was right and who was wrong here. One man went away justified, and it wasn't the one you think. The man that humbled himself is the one that went away justified and good with God. When they left that temple, one man was ready to meet his Maker. One man. And it wasn't the one that society would have said was right. When that tax collector walked out of that place, he was still a tax collector. He knew it. And the next time he came to the temple, I'm sure he prayed exactly the same way because he knew, this is who I am. Now, Jesus warned his disciples about this. He warned him when he said, be careful. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Be careful. Don't take a little bit and make yourself something big because of it. Don't put yourself above the man standing next to you on the street. Don't put yourself above anyone. Because we are all nothing. Without him, we're all nothing. We don't take pride in who we are. We need to take pride in who he is. That's it. It's easy for us to transfer that onto ourselves. And that's what this Pharisee is doing. He's basking in the glory so much that he thinks he's the one that's glowing. That's not what's intended for us. And that's not what Jesus intended for us. We need to be careful. And we need to beware of the yeast. And if you know this passage in Mark, there's a sadness that goes even with this. This last week when we had youth, the kids and I looked at the Transfiguration. Boy, was that a 50-cent word. Kids didn't have any idea what a transfiguration was. We talked about it a little bit. But one of the things we talked about was, what did the disciples feel when they were there seeing it? When those three men saw the transfiguration, what did they feel? What did they think? We know Peter said something. But what did they feel? What did they think? What did they do when they were standing there with Jesus and that happened? And they heard the voice of God say, this is my son whom I love. Listen to him. Well, Jesus tells his disciples this, be careful, watch out for the yeast. And the Bible in the next passage says, they started talking amongst themselves and said, he's saying this because we didn't have any bread. The frustration that Jesus must have felt. Oh, you're still not getting it. I think about myself. And that day that I'm going to have to stand in front of Jesus and look him in the eye. And I think about in my own life, how many times have I had Jesus look at me and just shake his head and say, you're still not getting it. You missed the big picture. As believers, it's important for us that we spend our time in prayer, that we spend our time in the Word, that we get more and more knowledge and get closer and closer to God. But let me tell you something. I don't care who they are, how many degrees they have, how many followers they have, how many people watch their television show or listen to them on the radio or buy their books. There is not a theologian in the world that knows it all.
Right.
There is no way any of us will ever know everything. All we can know for sure is that we're a sinner. And without that cross, that's all we are. That's a basic fundamental truth that we can know. We go closer to God by getting in the Word. We go closer to God by spending time with Him. All those things will happen, but we will never be with Him until we are face to face with Him. And at that point in time, we are going to have to answer for our faith. Who are you and what brings you to me? And the only thing we can answer is your Son. The only thing we can say is the blood of Christ is the only reason I'm standing here in front of you and the only reason I can survive this encounter. And if we live every single day in that knowledge and in that belief and in that humility, the time comes we stand before Him, that humility will be easy to handle. If we stand every single day and put ourselves on a scale and say, well, I'm better than the guy standing next to me, try and use that when you're facing God. Well, I'm better than that guy standing behind me in line. I don't think that's going to work. So how do we put this into our lives today? Well, I think first of all, we need to spend ourselves in our time in prayer, just like it says, confessing ourselves first. I was angry. My thoughts went the wrong way. My mouth went the wrong way. I acted in a way that I know was contrary to the love of Christ. Whatever it is, every single day we do something. And by acknowledging that, recognizing that, seeking it out, claiming it, naming it, saying what it is, we're acknowledging ourselves as sinners.